Welcome to the studios of The Last Brain Thinking, the #1 mental agility game show.
The Last Brain Thinking was commissioned from BBC Schools. They were wanting a series of brain training games to sit on their Onion Street site. Onion Street is a very popular website for children aged between 11 and 16, as it offers a lot of help and support around the topic of homework. Last Brain Thinking was our first breakthrough into multiplayer gaming, so this was going to be a very exciting project for us. A key requirement at the start of the project was to find an educational consultant in the field of neurology, and we were very lucky early on to find the help and support from Dr. Paul Howard-Jones from Bristol University. Dr. Paul was on hand throughout the whole of the project, just to ensure that the games that we were creating did have a sound educational rationale and were actually training the brain. Throughout the project, we would take the games into our local secondary school and test them on children of that actual age range and children who would potentially be using the Onion Street website.
A lot of the actual parts of the game are actually, the ideas for them are drawn from actual psychological tests, if you like, and different tools which are used to explore things such as executive function and working memory and visual memory. That was part of the inspiration, if you like, looking at some of these rather weird things we do as psychologists to test the brain, and then developing them into fun games.
So I was the lead animator on the Last Brain Thinking, and our first sort of challenge was to come up with a kind of creative concept for the games, which we based on some popular TV game shows. And for that we came up with two characters, Lenny Cortex and Spinus McLobe. Lenny Cortex was a classic sleazy game show host, whereas Spinus McLobe was a little bit more initially the idea was you sort of ineffectual character who kind of hung around on the fringes of the set. One of the challenges we faced was to design characters that were based on little brains, because we found when we first started that if you draw a brain and put little legs on it, it actually looks quite horrific, and we didn't want it to be grotesque. We wanted them to be quite cute, to appeal to as broad a possible an audience. And so we went through a number of different styles of brains before we arrived at the finished characters that you see in the Last Brain Thinking.
I was in charge of building the waiting room and the single player games, which are used as the brain warm-up exercises before you hit the studios. We worked very closely with Dr. Paul Howard-Jones to build the games, to ensure that the games we were building were targeting the areas of the brain that needed testing.
Because one thing which is different, I think, about this game compared with other games is it's not testing educational knowledge, it's actually testing the cognitive skills that underlie the acquisition of that education. And that's one thing I really like about it.
As an incentive to play the single player games, we introduced tokens, which can then be used to purchase items of clothing to personalise your brain. So when you're in the multiplayer arena, you can stand out from the others. So the more games you play, the more items you can choose from.
My involvement within the project was to take all the single player games and convert them into a multiplayer game. This was to allow anywhere between 3 to 8 players from around the world to play against each other. I used a mixture of Adobe Flash, and for the server technology I used Jabber, which uses XML as a communication.
The multiplayer aspect of The Last Brain Thinking is really good fun, and when you set up a studio to challenge your friends and battle it out, especially in the brain to brain round, it really raises competition against everyone and rewards for winning are simply great.
So difficult when you're constructing these games. I think people always jump to their own conclusions about actually what's going on, what's supposed to be going on. But I think this game does much better than anything else I've seen in terms of actually, making sure that it's actually presenting appropriate constructions about how we think and how our brains operate.